Afriqiyah Airways Flight 771 is in trouble, and the pilots don't even know how quickly things will turn deadly. It's the end of a long overnight flight. The crew are tired, fatigued, and lost in a thick fog as they desperately try to find the runway at Tripoli Airport. But they can't find it, and are about to crash. Breaking free of the fog, the plane hits the ground just seconds later, a matter of meters short from the safety of a runway. A series of mistakes, misinterpretations, distractions, poor planning, and incomplete information have left the aircraft in a state of ruin, the accident claiming the lives of over 100 people. For investigators, what's puzzling is that this accident presents many familiar tones. It's a type of plane crash the aviation sphere has spent decades trying to prevent. Yet, here we are. If we were to piece this mystery back together, what exactly would we find? Well, getting to the heart of this accident not only requires an understanding of the chain of events that brought this plane to its critical moment, but also an understanding of the sensory human dangers that can threaten the lives of anyone who boards an airplane. Johannesburg Airport, South Africa, the evening of Tuesday, May 11th, 2010. At South Africa's largest airport, crowds have been building up lately. The 2010 FIFA World Cup kicks off in less than a month, and it's another busy evening at the African hub, with many international flights scheduled to leave tonight. Amongst the many travellers passing through the airport is 42-year-old Brie O'Mara. She is an Irish South African who began her travels in Durban. Brie is a novelist, and she has a meeting with her publishers in London ahead of the release of her new book. She actually does have a bit of history with aviation. She once worked as a flight attendant for Gulf Air. For Brie and many other passengers, flying to Europe has recently become a surprisingly difficult and frustrating affair. Thousands of miles away, a volcanic eruption in Iceland has scattered volcanic ash into the atmosphere, settling over much of Europe. For a period of about 2 months in 2010, the Eyjafjallajökull eruption had been causing massive travel disruption, leading to the cancellation of thousands of flights, leaving countless numbers of travelers and planes stranded. It's thrown airline schedules into complete disarray. This time, our South African writer has booked a rather new, alternative way of getting to London. She walks through the airport over to her gate, where a brand new Airbus A330 awaits. It belongs to Afriqiyah Airways, which is a Libyan state-owned airline based in Tripoli, and was a favourite project of the country's then dictator. A year ago in 2009, Afriqiyah had received the delivery of 3 of these Airbus A330-200s, which the airline had planned to use for an ambitious expansion of their route network, not only across Africa, but intercontinentally as well. Tripoli to Johannesburg is among the first of these new routes. Truly, with return tickets between London and Johannesburg running you as little as £230, the airline had recently been positioning itself as a cheaper alternative for travellers going between South Africa and Europe, with Tripoli as a layover. Tonight, there are a total of 93 passengers on board Flight 771 to Tripoli. A majority of them are Dutch nationals who are returning home following safari vacations in South Africa. Many of them had the flight booked as part of their itineraries through their travel agents and tour guides, and are expected to connect onto other Europe-bound flights leaving Tripoli in the morning. Among them is the Van Assau family from Tilburg, Mum Trudy, Dad Patrick, and their 2 boys, 11-year-old Enzo and 9-year-old Ruben. 11 crew members are also on the flight, 8 flight attendants and the 3 pilots. The flight crew consisting of a captain, a first officer co-pilot and a relief co-pilot. All 3 pilots had flown the outbound leg and landed in Johannesburg in the early hours of May 11th, where they arrived and signed off from work at 5:15 in the morning local time. With an intermediate 15-hour scheduled rest period, the flight crew arrived back at Johannesburg Airport at just before 8:30 in the evening. The captain, 57-year-old Yusuf Al-Sadi, is a highly experienced Libyan pilot of over 17,000 flight hours. Before joining Afriqiyah in 2007, he had previously worked for the other Libyan airline, Libyan Arab Airlines, commanding historically the Fokker 28 and the Boeing 727. In the 2000s, he trained on the Airbus A320, where he had flown for the Tunisian airline Nouvel Air, and even whilst employed with Afriqiyah, continued to fly with Nouvel Air under contract. The first officer, 42-year-old Tariq Abu Shawashi, is a pilot of 4,200 flight hours. Joining them, serving as the relief co-pilot, is 37-year-old Nazim Al-Tahouni at just shy of 2,000 flight hours. Rather interestingly, all three pilots had logged the exact same number of hours on the A330 at 516. It's hard to say if this is just a coincidence, or if they had all been rostered into work the same flights on the same aircraft after transitioning to the A330, which was a new plane in the airline's fleet. All three pilots had previously flown the A320 and received A330 conversion training at the Airbus facility in Toulouse. The airline itself was subject to a series of audits and reviews during this time. The Libyan Civil Aviation Authority had audited the airline as part of the Air Operations Certification Renewal, and IATA was in the process of performing a safety audit at the time as well, revealing no major findings found on training, safety, and operation. Despite these reviews, a certain event had flown under the radar. Both the captain and first officer had both been involved in a bit of a flying mishap 2 weeks ago on April 28th. On that day, the crew were conducting a routine approach into Tripoli that didn't exactly go to plan. The final descent was initiated 1 mile short of the final approach fix, which activated the Airbus's terrain awareness warning system. The pilots performed a missed approach, and a lack of management over the aircraft's thrust had resulted in a flap overspeed during the go-around. This sort of incident is a reportable event, and the flight crew should have filed a report with the airline when it happened. However, according to Afriqiyah Airways, no such report was received on this occasion. It's a beautiful evening for flying. The skies are calm and clear. It is common practice at the airline that, under such conditions, the first officer will take on the role of the pilot flying. Captain Al-Sadi will be handling the radios, taking on the role of pilot monitoring. He does have a scheduled rest break during the flight, in which the relief co-pilot will take a position on the flight deck. Though the captain is officially designated as the pilot not flying, he is still the commander of the flight, and therefore still commands a certain level of authority. When the crew got on board the plane and reviewed the technical log, no write-ups had been recorded since they last left the aircraft. Previous outstanding maintenance work was carried out in Tripoli on May 10th, with no further entries. That said, pilots of this particular aircraft had been recording a rather specific occurrence. The captain's side stick priority button was reported as being a bit sticky, leading to a delay in its operation, which was usually around 3 seconds. At the time, official practices to deal with this issue had not been published by Airbus in their maintenance manuals. Afriqiyah's own maintenance team still decided to clean and test the button without official guidance, refurbishing it to a usable condition, but still over time the snag persisted. Aside from this, no further flaws are present with the aircraft. At 9:45 in the evening, Afriqiyah Airways Flight 771 leaves Johannesburg for the 8-hour overnight flight to Tripoli. Heading north, leaving South Africa behind, Flight 771 climbs to a cruising altitude of 40,000 feet, or flight level 400. The cruise phase of the flight was very much uneventful. It's a long night ahead, and in the cruise, Captain Al-Sadi leaves the flight deck to take his scheduled rest. The relief co-pilot takes position on the flight deck, and the first officer is still the pilot flying. The plane is following a pre-programmed flight path that is loaded into the flight management system. The Multi-Function Control Display Unit, or MCDU for short, is an Airbus pilot's tool for programming and managing all aspects of the flight. Pilots can load in a flight plan and input various performance factors the Airbus then uses to calculate and achieve optimal performance, flying the plane in a common managed mode, but we'll talk a little more about this later. For now, according to the MCDU, they are estimating an arrival into Tripoli at roughly 6 AM. For reference, all times going forward will be adjusted to reflect local Libyan time, that is UTC +2. The passengers in the cabin were likely trying to settle and rest themselves. For the next several hours, the A330 continues on autopilot, passing over Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, DRC, and Central African Republic. The flight thus far is uneventful. As we'll soon move on to analysing the accident sequence, I'd like to preface that the following is based on the findings of the official investigation and the final report published by the Libyan Civil Aviation Authority. I feel it's important to recognise that the investigation into this accident, although Libya received international assistance, especially from Europe, it was far from an uneventful investigation, given the outbreak of the Libyan civil war less than a year later and the massive regime change that followed. The final report was eventually published in 2013, and we're going to proceed putting our trust in the investigation and its findings. It's 4:10 in the morning and the plane is cruising over Chad. Captain Al-Sadi returns from his rest and retakes his position. The relief co-pilot now switches to a jump seat on the flight deck where he will remain for the rest of the flight. Soon the plane will cross over into Libyan airspace and they're still on track to make the 6 in the morning arrival. At 4:30 the captain contacts controllers in Sabah. At this time, the controller stationed here forwards to the Afriqiyah crew the weather information they have on hand from Tripoli. It will be updated soon, but according to this weather report, conditions look fine for their arrival. Visibility of 7 kilometers, clear skies, light winds. For the next hour, they continue northbound. It's at 5:29, little over half an hour from their scheduled arrival, that they finally get in contact with a controller in Tripoli, who immediately clears the flight for an approach to runway 09 and instructs them to fly direct to the approach path. An updated weather report has also been published. Visibility of 6 kilometers, winds calm, clear skies. The weather still looks fine for the morning arrival, and this was again forwarded to the crew, who now expect there to be no difficulties in conducting the approach and landing. With that, Flight 771 begins its descent into Tripoli. Oh, hi there. So nice to see you. I need to talk to you about this approach. Are you ready? Alright, so here's the thing. This accident really revolves around what happened during the approach phase of the flight. To really help us unpack everything moving forward, we really need to know a bit more about the Tripoli airport itself and the approach the pilots are about to attempt. A good jumping off point may be the instrument approach chart for the Locator runway 09 arrival that was in use on the morning of the accident, and we can use this to help familiarize ourselves with it. So this is Tripoli Airport. It has 2 runways that intersect, one going north to south and the other east to west. It's this east-west runway marked runway 0927 that Flight 771 would be arriving on. Like most major airports in 2010, as you'd expect, Tripoli International had instrument guidance for approaches, including a standard instrument landing system or ILS. The ILS being a system that precisely guides aircraft to a runway both laterally and vertically. Although, at Tripoli, the ILS situation was rather limited. To our understanding, the airport only ever had ILS on runway 27, that being the arrival from the east. But the active runway at the time was runway 09, the arrival from the west, and this had also been in use the night before. Now, because runway 09 lacks ILS, this means that pilots navigating an approach to runway 09 have to fly a non-precision approach, using different equipment that can only provide lateral horizontal guidance. The titular locator in the Locator approach is a non-directional beacon station denoted as Tango Whiskey, TW. The locator beacon is aligned directly under the approach path and transmits a radio signal that pilots can pick up on their instruments, pointing them in the direction of the station. So the beacon can be used to intercept the course for the runway. Tango Whiskey is a very key point in the approach, in that it also acts as our final approach fix that defines the point where the final approach begins. But there are other points in relation to the approach and the accident that we should also make ourselves familiar with. Positioned at the south side of the airport, just south of the main runway, is a VOR DME station with the identification of Tango Papa India, TPI. The VOR is a different radio beacon that also transmits signals that pilots can use. This VOR also has distance measuring equipment, DME, which means that a pilot, in addition to a lateral bearing to the station, can also receive the aircraft's current distance to it. Now, for a locator or non-directional beacon approach, you would use that beacon to navigate course for the airport and not the VOR. In this case, it's the locator that is aligned with the approach path, whereas the VOR is kind of off-center, being to the south of the runway. The heading is a bit skewed. Although that is not to say an approach can't be navigated with the VOR. In fact, there does exist an official VOR DME runway 09 approach at Tripoli that wasn't being used here on this occasion. But that distance information can be very useful. Because we have now established the VOR at the airport, we can pin Tango Whiskey at precisely 5.2 miles from the TPI VOR, or 3.9 miles from the foot of the runway. Remember this, I promise you it will be important later. There is another radio beacon denoted as Delta that is much closer to the airport at just 0.6 miles from the runway. This acts as what we call the missed approach point, which speaks for itself. It's the point at which the missed approach procedure is executed if, for whatever reason, the approach can't continue. That can be if the runway is not in sight, or if the approach is unstable, things like that. So, now let's talk about how this approach is flown. Pilots are established on the inbound course of 090, 10 miles from the airport at an altitude of 2,000 feet. Now, remember, those navigational points on the ground only provide lateral guidance to pilots. A vertical profile can be found in the published approach procedure. There is a descent down to 1,350 feet, which we're going to round to 1,400, and this becomes the platform altitude from which the final approach will be conducted. An inbound plane proceeds to the final approach fix, Tango Whiskey, and the final approach begins. This can be flown following a step-down procedure that levels off again at the minimum descent altitude, which, in this case, is 620 feet. Preferably though, a pilot can employ a continuous descent, either utilizing vertical guidance from onboard equipment, more on that soon, or by selecting a descent rate themselves, this typically being a flight path angle of -3 degrees, and this gives you a normal slope down. The minimum descent altitude should not be crossed without visual reference to the airport. Normally, by the time they descend down to it, the pilots will have the runway in sight, if not sooner if it's a clear day, and if they do, they can safely land visually. Otherwise, a go-around should be made if the airport still goes unseen by the time they reach the missed approach point. Now, I've explained this using the raw data from the instrument approach chart, the same chart the pilots would have had and been familiar with. However, this was an Airbus A330, one of the most technologically advanced and computerized airplanes around, and airliner pilots of today, especially those who fly Airbus planes, can take advantage of all of that technology, even for non-precision approaches like these. At first glance, non-precision approaches appear more complicated, without the assistance of ILS, requiring extra steps, demanding greater attention from the pilots. However, modern airliners building on developments such as the introduction of flight management systems and GPS have made these seemingly complicated procedures simpler. Within the Airbus framework, the plane can be flown using the managed and selected modes. In manage mode, the flight management system controls the autopilot and flight parameters within the constraints of the information the pilot loaded into the MCDU: the flight plan, fuel information, altitude data, and so on. Based on the database of the flight management system, the computer will automatically calculate the most optimal way to achieve its targets. That can even include optimized climb and descent profiles and approach paths that even take into account any published restrictions and requirements of the flight. Selected mode, on the other hand, is, well, a little more hands-on. This is the Airbus Flight Control Unit, or FCU for short. It is functionally the Airbus autopilot panel. In this shot, we can see various parameters are in manage mode, indicated here by these dots and dashes. Switching to the selected mode, target parameters can be selected by the pilot. For example, how quickly they would like to climb or descend, the airspeed of the aircraft, a change of heading, stuff like that. Now, managed mode can be used for non-precision approaches. A non-precision approach can be selected in the MCDU, and following the managed guidance principle, the Airbus computers will not only provide lateral guidance, but vertical guidance too, as a computer-generated guidance beam that follows the specifications and minimums of that particular approach can be created, allowing for a continuous descent to the runway in an ILS-ish fashion. This stands in contrast to selected guidance, which is closer to what we discussed before. Selected guidance requires a pilot to follow the outline in the approach chart themselves. Selecting the track FPA mode on the FCU, pilots can input guidance manually, selecting the lateral track to the runway and a flight path angle. As you can probably imagine, employing the managed guidance strategy is usually preferred as it reduces pilot workload, though selected guidance can still be useful. Actually, do you remember earlier how we mentioned that our captain previously worked for Nouvelle Air, the Tunisian airline? Well, Nouvelle Air, at least at the time, only permitted selected guidance for non-precision approaches, so he was likely very well versed with using the selected mode on the Airbus for this purpose. At the end of the day, this is a simple, non-precision approach that any airline pilot should be able to perform, and again, for our pilots today, they know this airport very well with prior history with the approach. Having said that, if, say, the weather is poor and the pilots cannot see the runway, well, they can't land. There are still minimums that need to be met, and this approach requires a cloud base of at least 300 feet above the ground and a visibility of at least 1,600 meters, that is roughly 1 mile at the minimum descent altitude. But wait! We already saw the weather report from Tripoli, didn't we? It was giving us visibility between 6 to 7 kilometers that morning, so according to that, the weather was well within limits. Right? Well, was it really? Did that weather report that was being issued, did that actually reflect the actual conditions at the airport? Unfortunately, no. Let's change focus for a minute and get a different perspective here, because things start getting interesting when we look at accounts from other pilots that morning. One of the first flights to leave Tripoli on May 12th was Alitalia Flight 871 to Rome. The Alitalia crew would later provide an account to investigators, where they recalled staying overnight in a hotel in the center of Tripoli. They observed that clouds were very low and visibility was very poor. They couldn't even see the tops of the buildings when they left. Once more, after arriving at the airport, the Alitalia crew were frustrated to discover that the weather reported on the airport's ATIS was not accurate to what they were seeing. In fact, it's from the previous evening and had not yet been updated. This had changed by the time they left the gate, but even then, with updated weather information, it's still inaccurate. Where it was being reported visibility was 7 kilometers, using their own eyes it appeared more like 2-kilometer conditions. Parts of the airport in the distance were disappearing behind the fog. The weather that was being reported was inconsistent and did not reflect the actual conditions at the airport. Back on board Flight 771, the pilots know none of this. For all they know, given the reports they have received, the weather is fine, as they now begin to turn their attention to their approach plans. An approach briefing is usually carried out between crew members to establish their conduct going forward, which is especially important for non-precision approaches that come with additional workload. Because Tripoli is their home base, their familiarity with the airport enabled them to conduct a shorter briefing, only covering some of the items in the operations manual. This was a common practice when arriving at a familiar airport, provided there are no present difficulties or special conditions to consider. Though, despite this, the investigation found that whatever briefing they did, it was very quick and incomplete. The first officer, the pilot flying, only verbally commented on a couple of items, highlighting the runway 09 arrival and briefly mentioning the auto brake setting. It doesn't appear to be that there was any mention of how the approach would be flown, managed or selected guidance, no mention of the captain's role as the pilot monitoring, no discussion of their strategy in the event of a go-around, and the served to clouds the mental map of the approach between crew members who are about to follow through with their approach without a clear action plan. Additionally, when a checklist is routinely carried out, items should be verbally called out and actioned between crew members. But when investigators later listened to the cockpit voice recording, they weren't able to confirm if an approach checklist had actually been completed, as so little verbal communication took place. Based on the fact that Tripoli is their home airport and they know it very well, in combination with the received weather information, this would seem to suggest that the crew are settling into a state of complacency. It's all routine to them, and from their perspective, no difficulties have presented themselves that would impede their landing. While the SOP of Afriqiyah Airways requires all crew to perform briefings as stated in the SOP, explaining the type of approach and the strategy of the remaining flight, but the fact that the approach briefing was incomplete indicates that at this period of the flight, it is very likely that the crew did not anticipate any special difficulty in the conduct and management of the approach. However, in spite of the time gained, the crew did not spend more time on discussing and sharpening focus on the essential points of the approach to be flown after the briefing. 5:54. The plane is heading north, and soon they will turn to establish on the inbound course for the runway. Around this time, it's now the pilots begin to touch on certain aspects of the approach. Let us do it, what is the name? It is better. Nav approach, it's approved as you know, the captain says to his first officer. Now, you don't need me to tell you that this language is obviously non-standard and ambiguous, though investigators believed the captain was expressing a desire to use managed guidance, so employing the Airbus computer to fly the final approach. The guidance mode on the FCU is now changed from the heading vertical speed mode to track FPA. For non-precision approaches, this is standard, but it does open up the lateral and vertical tools for selected guidance. The captain makes a quick verbal comment on the mode change, likely verifying that the flight path vector, FPV, also known as the bird, has replaced the standard flight director on the primary flight display. This is a simple visual tool that indicates lateral drift and vertical slope, projecting a visualization of what the aircraft is doing. So, in a short space of time, we have some comments from the captain regarding the approach. However, the captain is not the one flying the plane. Investigators reckoned that the first officer became a bit confused around this time, and took the comments from the captain as an intention to carry out the approach in managed lateral guidance with selected vertical guidance. So that is to say, the flight computer is flying the navigation path while the pilot inputs or selects their descent for final approach. I will do it when established, the first officer says. He doesn't clearly say he is going to navigate the approach using either guidance method. It becomes unclear now if the pilots are on the same page here, and there is little communication to clear this up. 5:58. The massive A330 changes course as to enter the inbound track at 10 miles from the airport. The crew begin to configure the aircraft, extending the flaps, landing gear, and they descend to 1400 feet as to be on profile for when reaching the Tango Whiskey beacon. The captain speaks up again. "Give it to the approach now," he says in Arabic. He is speaking here in reference to the approach button on the FCU. Under managed guidance, this would allow the autopilot to fly the vertical path the captain was likely expecting to use. At 6 miles from the runway, they really can't see much from the flight deck. They're now deep in the fog that they weren't expecting. The pilots continue configuring the aircraft, turning their attention again to the flap setting, bringing them out to their final position for landing. Around this time, Flight 771 is transferred to Tripoli Tower. At the same time, the first officer also calls for the landing checklist. However, the captain is now currently busy communicating with the tower, who instructs them to continue the approach and to report the runway in sight. He doesn't give a landing clearance just yet, so in the meantime, our first officer looks towards the FCU panel. Based on the analysis of investigators, it appears that in all of the confusion in how the approach would be flown, the first officer was now under the impression that the selected guidance method was being employed. Now holding at 1400, he thinks he should now select a descent flight path angle, this being the 3-degree slope that is to be engaged after passing the Tango Whiskey beacon. He leans forward and selects -3 degrees in the flight path angle window and pulls the selection knob. Upon doing this, the plane has now been instructed to enter the slope selected, and the A330 begins a descent. Here's the thing, the plane has been given this instruction too early, descending from the 1400 platform altitude roughly 5.2 miles from the runway. This 5.2 mile figure may sound familiar to you. We discussed it before, remember? You better, I did tell you this would be important. The descent for final approach is supposed to begin here at the Tango Whiskey beacon, which is 5.2 miles from the TPI VOR, not the runway threshold, which is 3.9 miles from Tango Whiskey. At the critical time the flight path angle was selected, Flight 771 was not yet at the final approach fix. They were, however, coincidentally, 5.2 miles from the runway, or roughly 6.5 miles from the TPI VOR. We cannot know why the first officer engaged this when he did, but there are a few possibilities that can explain what is going on here. On one hand, the first officer, if he was looking at the MCDU, may have confused the distance between their current position and the runway with the 5.2 mile figure associated with the distance between Tango Whiskey and the VOR, which is when the final approach is supposed to begin. There may also have been confusion with the VOR DME approach, which is on a different chart. On the other hand, though he may have entered the 3-degree slope into the FPA window, he may have just unintentionally engaged it at the same time. You see, the documentation provided to Afriqiyah Airways from Airbus recommended that pilots enter the 3-degree slope about 1 mile from the top of descent, engaging it roughly 0.2 miles out, so he may well have been following Airbus protocol but just accidentally initiated the descent sooner than intended. Alternatively, he may have been aware that the descent had begun, but had mistakenly believed in that moment that they had either passed or were overhead Tango Whiskey. To be clear, that wasn't the case, and he would even verbally mention the beacon in just a few moments. Unfortunately, whatever the case, the descent had been started a little over 1 mile short compared to where it should have. He now inputs the go-around altitude and tries to communicate the 3-degree slope with the captain, which would indicate he is preparing for landing and executing the landing checklist. But at the same time, another aircraft radios a message to Flight 771. It's Afriqiyah Airways Flight 721, a flight that has just landed in Tripoli ahead of the accident flight. Extraordinarily, the pilot of this aircraft calls out to Captain Al-Sadi by his first name, which completely consumes his attention. This other flight warns the crew of thick fog on short final. According to the account from this pilot, he could reportedly see the airport during the approach through the mist, but conditions rapidly deteriorated due to passing through dense cloud layers that had moved in right before reaching the minimum descent altitude. That was only a matter of minutes ago, and conditions have only gotten worse. Flight 771 can't see the runway either. It's around this time that the early morning Alitalia flight to Rome was on the taxi out toward runway 09 for departure. Tripoli Airport's ground and tower stations share the same frequency, and the Italian crew could hear the conversations taking place. They may even have had visual contact with Afriqiyah 721 that had landed just moments ago. Hearing the radio transmissions of the extant flight, knowing they are on final approach, they switch on their aircraft's Traffic Collision Avoidance System, TCAS, which pings the aircraft on the TCAS display screen, allowing them to locate the plane, which they can't see yet through the fog. It's 6 AM, exactly on the hour. The first officer continuing the approach, he now sees that they are about to pass Tango Whiskey. He likely noticed this by glancing at the navigation display. He calls this out to the captain, who reports their position to the tower. Passing this beacon should have been an opportunity to assess the altitude, an opportunity to cross-reference their current altitude to what was in the approach chart or even in the MCDU. This could have informed them that they are now crossing Tango Whiskey at an altitude lower than that outlined in the official published procedure. In fact, they are now at just 980 feet, 400 feet lower than where they should be. However, neither pilot comments on this. If, as investigators suspect, the captain believed the plane to be descending under the managed guidance strategy, he may have had full faith in the automated systems of Airbus and thought none the wiser to what was actually going on. This is to say, instead of cross-checking the flight parameters, he took the Tango Whiskey call-out as an invitation to radio to Tripoli Tower to receive a landing clearance. "Confirm clear to land if we have the runway in sight," he says on frequency. "Affirmative, clear to land, wind calm." The controller has now cleared Flight 771 for a landing without them clearly expressing they have visual contact with the runway. Though seconds later they may not see much, but they do hear something.
100 above.
The Airbus plane itself is audibly telling the pilots that they are approaching the minimum descent altitude. The airport has to come into view before they can cross it. They are running out of time. The first officer is desperately looking out to spot some runway approach lights, but he sees nothing. He comments, "You see?" The captain simply responds, "Continue." A comment like, "you see," you might agree can be perceived in different ways. Now, we don't have the actual recording from the black box, but based on the text of the transcript, we could interpret this as an invitation extended to the captain for assistance in locating the airport. Announcing "continue," the captain intends to continue the approach, and the first officer agrees. For the next 10 seconds, the crew don't communicate, as the plane now crosses the MDA decision height much earlier than they should, and now also without visual contact with the airport. At this pace, the plane will crash 1 mile short of the runway. Now, a reminder that it is impossible to know what the crew were thinking during this time. The first officer could have assumed that the captain had some sort of other outside visual references, or maybe had even spotted the first signs of runway lights, whereas he had not yet. The captain, for his part, perhaps he thought the lights of the runway would come into view any second now. Maybe his attention was still directed elsewhere, possibly focusing on the weather, or communicating with or thinking about this other aircraft or the tower. All of this is to try and explain why, if they can't see the runway, don't they initiate a go-around, which also gestures to the possibility of the crew being under the influence of the ever-so-pervasive plan continuation bias, also known as get-there-itis. In other words, they could have been motivated to continue the approach on the grounds that they just want to get home, and aborting the landing could be costly from a cognitive standpoint after a long night of flying. Now below 600 feet, the first officer, clearly knowing the situation is precarious, they are below decision height and don't have the runway in sight, he now does ask the captain if they should abort and go around.
300.
The Airbus computer calls out again. He repeats the 300 call out to Captain Al-Sadi. For just a moment, he pauses, but then,
"Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain."
The Airbus terrain awareness and warning system echoes out in the cockpit. It's telling the pilots that they are too close to the ground. The warning takes priority over anything else, and the captain makes the call. Go around, go around, go around, the captain shouts. The first officer immediately leaps in, executing the missed approach memory items. The autopilot is disconnected, the throttles are pushed to toga, and now, under manual control, our pilot flying makes a nose-up input on the Airbus side stick. The go-around action occurred quickly, without any haste upon the captain's command. He wasn't expecting it, and under the effects of being alarmed like this, he doesn't make the appropriate go-around call-outs to the first officer, such as verifying a positive rate of climb and monitoring flight parameters. The missed approach procedure requires a steady straight-ahead climb to 2,000 feet, followed by a large right turn, returning to the Tango Whiskey waypoint. There, a missed approach can transition back to the start. Given what happened next, the following seconds looked nothing like this. Shortly after the plane started climbing again, the pilots turned their attention to retracting the flaps. As part of the missed approach memory items, the flaps are retracted one step, in this case from the full position to position 3. However, the aircraft is accelerating rapidly. The first officer can see by looking at the speed tape on the primary flight display that they are coming close to a flap overspeed situation again, and he repeatedly calls out the flaps to the captain. Investigators were of the opinion that the crew's rapid change in focus from flying the plane to focusing heavily on the flaps is due to not wishing to replicate the incident the same crew were involved in 2 weeks previously. As a result, this took attention away from flying the plane. The flap handle and the flap indication are to the left of the first officer. The flight data recorder would reveal that while the crew were fixated on the flaps, the first officer's right hand on the side stick transitioned forward, as if he were executing a nose-down input. It's only been a matter of seconds since the go-around was initiated. The plane has only climbed to a peak of 670 feet before following through on that nose-down command. The Airbus begins its final descent. Your vestibular system of the inner ear is responsible for your sense of balance and spatial orientation. The canals of the vestibular labyrinth and the otolith organs are oriented to correspond to different planes of movement. The canals themselves are filled with a fluid that interact with hairs that can be found in the same canals, movement of which signals to the brain changes in head position and motion of the body. Thinking about this within the structure of flying an airplane, changes in speed, pitch, roll, yaw, or whatever have the effect of creating this movement in the inner ear. And when paired with visual cues such as looking out of the window or at the flight instruments, this can allow a pilot to easily identify what is going on, determining that yes, the plane is doing a thing and the body is responding to that. However, human biology is at odds with the human's desire to take flight. Our bodies did not evolve to fly. The sky is not our natural domain yet, and airplanes are something that we just made up. Because of a vestibular quirk of human biology, the forces associated with linear acceleration and deceleration and changes in pitching head motion apply similar effects on the inner ear, and the brain has a rather difficult time differentiating that on its own. It can't tell the difference. So, what would happen if during these changes, the visual information was, for some reason, withheld? Well, the short answer there is that a pilot becomes vulnerable to sensory deception, spatial disorientation. For example, during a phase of strong acceleration, a disoriented pilot can falsely perceive that acceleration as a continual pitching up of the nose, when that's not actually what's happening. This is called a somatogravic illusion, and it is at least in part responsible for numerous plane crashes over the years. And Afriqiyah Flight 771 is unfortunately one of those. The time of day when all of this occurred was at just after 6 o'clock in the morning. During the month of May, that makes sunrise or dawn in central North Africa. The sun was coming up, It wasn't bright out or broad daylight by any means, but it also distinctively wasn't fully nighttime. On a clear day flying east towards the runway in Tripoli, this would have provided a relatively clear horizon outside. However, we both know that was not the case on the morning of May 12, 2010. The plane had descended into poor visibility conditions. There was no visual contact with the airport or even with the horizon outside. Even though the sun was starting to rise, under the clouds and fog they still wouldn't have been able to see much outside. As you can imagine, relying on instruments becomes very important in these conditions. But now you know what's coming, don't you? The plane was accelerating because this had happened during a go-around and maximum thrust had been applied. Then, unfortunately, the crew became distracted by the flap situation, with the first officer turning his attention away from the instruments. So now the plane is accelerating and he is not taking in any visual indications of what the plane is actually doing. He became the puppet of a cinematographic illusion. Distracted, the plane held in his right hand was at the mercy of the first officer's sensory experiences. The illusion kicks in. His mind now interprets the acceleration as a continual pitching up of the nose. In response to this perceived change in pitch, his hand on the side stick translates forward to counter it. And he would have held that so long as he was under the influence of this illusion. About 21 seconds. And during that time, the nose pitched from 12.5 degrees nose up to 3.5 degrees nose down, causing the plane to enter this final descent. The first officer, distracted, is applying nose-down inputs on the side stick. The captain, on the other hand, is also distracted, not only from being startled by the need to go missed, but also with the heavy focus now being put on the flaps and airspeed. The plane only continues to accelerate as the nose drops. The captain actually does make some subtle inputs on the left side stick which were recorded on the flight data recording, and rather incredibly, he also makes nose down inputs, suggesting that he too, if distracted, may also have been under the spell of a cinematographic illusion. However, at this point, his side stick movements were not enough to meet the conditions to trigger the dual input warning or illuminate the side stick priority lights. Suddenly, the terrain awareness and warning system activates again. It is now that the first officer pulls back on the side stick. The captain, meanwhile, can't understand what is going on. He now wants to take back control of the aircraft. 1 second after the alert sounds, he presses the captain's side stick priority button. It takes a few seconds to activate, likely due to the stubborn stickiness of the button recorded in the technical log. The captain now pushes forward. Investigators did emphasize that this input could be the result of a spasm, but it could also be an indication of the persistence of the cinematographic illusion and its influence over the captain. He doesn't call out that he is taking control, and the captain's priority nullifies inputs from the first officer, who is now trying to pull the plane up. A priority left oral warning should have activated but was likely drowned out by the TAWS messages which have greater priority. Plummeting below 200 feet, in less than 2 seconds the plane will crash. Only now does the captain realize what is happening. He too begins pulling back on the side stick, but it's too late. The plane suddenly breaks free of the clouds and the ground emerges into view. In the final second before the crash, Captain Al-Sadi releases his hand from the side stick. All the while, the first officer kept pulling back till the very end. A large orange glow fills the sky around Tripoli Airport. The outbound Alitalia flight watched the whole thing. The pilots sat there stunned as the plane broke out of the clouds and impacted the ground right in front of their eyes. Picking up the radios, they announce on frequency that Flight 771 has crashed. Controllers in Tripoli can't believe the news. They can't even see the crashed aircraft from their position. They need the Alitalia flight to report the location of the wreckage, as they were much closer. The plane has crashed very close to the runway. Fire and rescue services were immediately dispatched to the site. But what they found when they arrived 8 minutes later was nothing but devastation. As day breaks, first responders descend on the crash site, combing through the wreckage for survivors. The plane made contact with the ground just south of the extended runway centerline, impacting wings level with an almost neutral nose pitch. When it hit the ground, the plane exploded, disintegrating in a fiery mass as it plowed its way through the ground. The debris field spanning nearly 800 meters. Plotted here are key wreckage locations. Throughout May 12th, bodies were pulled from the wreckage. Afriqiyah Airways issued multiple statements and updates, and provided international assistance to those who had lost loved ones, fronting travel and accommodation at their expense. Libya even relaxed some visa requirements for those affected and who wished to visit on short notice. But then, some rather incredible news came through from the crash site. Rescuers had found a young boy still strapped in his seat, severely injured but alive. It was 9-year-old Ruben van Assau who was sitting in seat 12D. He was pulled out of the seat and transported to a hospital in Tripoli for treatment and transferred to another for urgent surgery. Unfortunately, he lost his mum, dad, and brother in the crash. In fact, Ruben is the sole survivor of Flight 771, which has claimed the lives of 103 people. As the majority of those on board the flight were Dutch nationals, the loss of this plane was a deep tragedy for the small European nation. Unfortunately, it won't be the last aviation disaster to befall the country this decade. A team from the Netherlands was dispatched to Libya the next day to assist Libyan authorities. The responsibility to investigate this accident fell to the Libyan Civil Aviation Authority as per Annex 13 to the International Convention on Civil Aviation. Although Libya did receive assistance from the Dutch Safety Board, the South African Civil Aviation Authority, the French BEA, and Airbus. In 2011, the outbreak of the Libyan civil war impeded the progress of the investigation for some time. However, in its aftermath, the investigation was able to finish with the release of this final report that outlines the narrative that we have discussed here today. While it is important to recognize contributing factors such as the meteorological situation and the potential tiredness of the crew, the final report highlighted shortcomings in pilot training, Afriqiyah Airways procedures, and the conduct of the flight crew. What's really baffling about this accident is that the pilots of this plane found themselves in a very similar situation 2 weeks before the crash, yet failed to identify when things were going wrong here. On April 28, 2010, the same crew were flying the same aircraft on the same non-precision approach into Tripoli, which resulted in a go-around. Recorded flight data from that flight revealed telling similarities to the data recorded on the accident flight. The final approach was carried out in selected guidance using the flight path angle selection. This was engaged before reaching Tango Whiskey, which led to them passing over the beacon lower than what the published procedure had outlined. There was a lack of control and stability of the nose during the go-around, and a lack of management over the thrust resulted in a flap overspeed accompanied by the oral overspeed warning. When such incidents occur, it is normal that crews file a report with the airline so that the event can be analysed and appropriate action taken. However, this crew never did that. Afriqiyah Airways had no record of the April 28th incident. Well, that was until after the crash on May 12th. You see, the airline is required by Libyan law to perform routine systemic flight analysis. The quick access recorder should be removed every 3 days or so for inspection of its flight data. It is usually sent to a flight safety office, but in this case, the hard drive containing the incident on April 28th was late and no analysis had been performed before the accident. This speaks to a critical systemic flaw that at the time was present within Afriqiyah. Because of this, no feedback was being provided by the crew, and in turn, the airline could not provide feedback to the pilots and provide assistance and training where necessary. All the while, this brushed up against the seemingly poor communication between the crew members. It was absolutely imperative that the two pilots discussed, briefed, and coordinated their approach plans. Sure, the weather was not great, but proper planning can allow these situations to become navigable when unexpected changes arise. What really exemplifies the breakdown in the relationship between the crew is that a go-around could have been called at any point by the pilot flying. It was the captain who finally made the call to go around, but the first officer was designated as the pilot flying. He should have been in a position to make that call himself without the approval of the captain. The fact that he didn't, or at least showed hesitation to do so, indicated to investigators that crew resource management principles were not being employed. Though the captain is the ultimate authority over the operation of the flight, other crew members should be elevated to a position to take the initiative, be proactive, and make critical contributions and decisions. They must be able to have the confidence to challenge that authority. CRM training has done a lot to democratize the cockpit, and if its principles are not applied, well, we end up with situations like this, and aviation history is littered with similar examples from all over the world, which is why we have sophisticated crew resource management training today. In the end, it was found that the pilots simply weren't in a position to properly assess the potential risks associated with managing non-precision approaches. During the go-around, the crew was surprised not to acquire visual references. On one hand, the crew feared exceeding the aircraft's speed limits in relation to its configuration. On the other hand, they were feeling the effects of somatographic illusion due to the aircraft acceleration. This probably explains the aircraft handling inputs, mainly nose-down inputs, applied during the go-around. These inputs were not consistent with what is expected in this flight phase. The degraded CRM did not make it possible for either crew member to identify and recover from the situation before the collision with the ground, even when the TAWS warnings were activated. Among the safety recommendations in the final report, investigators recommended that Airbus and Afriqiyah Airways incorporate more specified training on the subject of somatographic illusions. The investigation highlighted the cultural shortcomings within Afriqiyah Airways, adding that pilots must adhere strictly to SOP, reportable events must be communicated, and the airline must introduce recurrent pilot training targeting the area of crew resource management. There were also safety recommendations aimed at Tripoli Airport itself, these mainly falling on the subject of the navigational facilities and weather infrastructure of the airport. Though it does need to be said that these recommendations weren't exactly the most useful in the end. The airport was wholly destroyed in 2014 when it became a battleground during the Second Libyan Civil War. The city had to move flight operations to Mitiga Airport, a converted military base on the coast, which has been the gateway for civilian flights in and out of Tripoli since. That said, talks of rebuilding the old airport have continued to surface over the years, and as of 2025, interest has been renewed, and work has begun on a new terminal with the hopes that the airport can one day be restored. Forgetting about that for the time being, one question still remains regarding the airport. Tripoli International did have a functioning ILS on runway 27. If it was clear that the weather was poor on the morning of the accident, why didn't they switch active runways so that the ILS could be used? Well, a back and forth between controllers at Tripoli would seem to suggest that serviceability of the ILS was in question. Despite a technical log revealing nav aids were working normally, if they were unsure if the ILS was functional or not, then that could have been a deciding factor in keeping the Locator 09 approach open. That said, ATC records also showed that there was in fact concern about the active runway that was in use, and when questioned, a controller revealed that several inbound flights that morning were supposedly too close to the airport to make the switch. This did not sit right with the investigation, who contested that all planes at this time were at least 10 miles away, which was more than enough to change active runways. Had ILS 27 been in use, this accident likely would not have occurred. As for Afriqiyah Airways, they have continued to struggle throughout the years. As an airline owned and operated by the Libyan state, its aircraft became targets during the First and Second Libyan civil wars. The remaining of the carrier's A330-200s have been lost due to conflict. More recently, the airline has continued to fall into disrepute due to ongoing mismanagement of the company and continued safety shortcomings, leaving the airline in a precarious condition as of 2025. The sole survivor of the crash returned home to the Netherlands after receiving treatment in Libya. Little is known about Ruben since the accident, which is fair, really. The media storm he became swept up in the aftermath, and the frankly disgraceful behaviour of journalists both in Libya and the Netherlands sounds absolutely horrifying. In 2016, a memorial was unveiled in the Netherlands dedicated to the lives lost in the Tripoli air disaster. Hello, good evening everyone. Thank you so much for watching this video and even making it through to the end. Wow, I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to drop a like on your way out. Thank you so much. Something exciting to announce now. I have finally, after 5 years of doing this, I finally have a Discord server. I will leave a link to it in the pinned comment if you'd like to check it out. There we can talk about video stuff, airplane stuff, and literally anything else, really. Can't wait to see you over there. It does make me a little nervous because running something like this is not something I'm used to, so I'm a little nervous but also very excited about it. Anyway, it is that time. It is Patreon time. A massive thanks is in order to the incredible Patreon contributors who have generously supported the channel. Their support has helped keep my videos independent, and also, right now at least, sponsor-free. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Of course, we have some shoutouts to get through this time, and we'll begin with the business class tier patrons. So in order of which they joined, a big thanks goes out to David Pierce, Gav, Pietro Gagliardi, Matt Ellis-Jones, Donna Muldoon, and Naomi Skilling. Thank you all so much. Then of course we have the newly joined first class tier, and these absolute legends have pledged at the highest tier recently, so big thanks goes out to Bobby, Fran Myers, Brandon, Joe Pilot, Anthony McBride, and Chuck H. What total legends, the whole lot of them. Thank you. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can always join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons do get early access to all new videos before they go out publicly. Alrighty then, that is pretty much going to be it from me for now. I have to get right back to work because I have to finish the next video before Christmas. If you'd like to follow me and also get updates as to what is going on, you can always follow me on my Twitter or Blue Sky, and now also you can join the Discord server. All of those links are going to be in the pinned comment too. So, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in December. Goodbye!